Hi. When we learn a foreign language, most of us have the similar experiences, especially when it comes to conversational situations. You want to say something and you feel that it's on the tip of your tongue, but you can't just put it into words. When it happens, would you want somebody leaning over your shoulder and whisper the words into your ears? If the answer is yes, you can take a look at community language learning, which I'm going to talk about today. And here's the layout of my presentation. I'm going to start with the definition and theoretical background of CLL and how it is implemented in classroom. Then I will move on to advantages and disadvantages of the community language learning and how to incorporate it into language classes. And finally, the conclusion. Let's start with the definition. Community language learning is an approach to language teaching in which learners decide which aspect of language to learn, whereas the teacher acts as a counselor. It's extremely learner-centered approach, and the interaction is seen as a medium to convey the language material. And building a sense of community is important in community language learning, and learners' feelings are recognized along with their emotions and intellect. Moving on to the next slide, we will see theoretical background of CLL. It was developed by Charles Arthur Curran in the 70s. Curran was a Jesuit priest, but he was also a professor of psychology, and he applied psychological counseling techniques to language teaching. And this technique would be later known as counseling learning approach. And in this approach, the student is likened to client, whereas teacher acts as a counselor, and the learner's fears are eliminating during the process. Curran and his associates adopted whole person learning, which gives much emphasis on feelings, reactions, and desire to learn, as well as the student's intellect. So it's one of the humanistic approaches to language teaching, along with the silent way, dissuggestionpedia, and total physical response. Moving on to the next slide, we will see an example of a classroom experiences. This is an adult learners class with beginner level. It's a monolingual class because native language plays an important role in community language learning. And the only resources we need are chairs, board, and a recorder. It can be a tape recorder, or it can be only a mobile phone. And there is no textbook, no established syllabus. The content is determined by learners by brainstorming in their native language. As you can see on the picture on the left, the students form a circle, whereas teacher is standing outside. The teacher lets the students decide the topic to talk about and tries to build a community atmosphere as much as possible. One of the classroom experiences that I've seen on YouTube shows a teacher bringing a birthday cake to celebrate one of the students' birthday. And the conversation is organized around exchanges between the students while they are trying to celebrate the birthday. Moving on to the next slide, we are going to see the second stage of CLL. So the topic is already decided and they are ready to start the class. And as you can see on the picture, the teacher is still outside the circle, but leaning over one of the students' shoulder and saying something. So here is how CLL plays out. First of all, a learner initiates the conversation by uttering a sentence in the native language. Then the teacher translates them into target language, and learners afterwards repeats the sentences or language chunks, and when the learner is ready, the teacher records the conversation and then allows the other students to speak, and then the teacher will record their conversations as well. And one by one, eliciting responses from the others, first in the native language and then translating them into the target language, a dialogue will slowly take shape. So after the recording session is over, the teacher joins the students and tries to elicit responses about the experiences using the native language. And students will probably say that they haven't learned anything, so it's quite normal because you can't just expect them to say something on the tape and memorize it afterwards. So teacher must reassure the students that they will have opportunity to listen to the dialogue again and learn the language chunks. So this discussion stage is also an opportunity to get to know one another and build a sense of community, and this session will not be recorded. Moving on to the next slide, we are going to see this other stage, which is called transcription. So if you look at the picture, you see learners forming a semicircle around the board so that they can see the teacher writing something on the board. So first of all, they listen to the recordings, and the teacher pauses at the end of each sentence and let them recall what they have said and say them again in the target language and translate them into native language. And then their teacher writes the sentences on the board. Learners first listen to the teacher repeating the sentences and then practice them. And they can also exploit the teacher as human computer. For example, if they are confused about pronunciation of words, they can just say it and allow the teacher to repeat it so they can learn the pronunciation. It's the same with the language chunks and sentences as well. And then finally, the last stage is called language analysis. So here, teacher can teach any language aspect that has arisen in the conversation. It could be tenses, particular grammar topic, or vocabulary. And teacher may emphasize the problems noticed during the recording. And teacher also can divide students into groups so that they can make group works and produce new sentences based on what they have learned in the previous stage. And teacher can walk from one group to another to help them. And the produced language during this stage is recorded and played, and at the end they sit together again and share their reflections on the experience. Moving on to the next slide, we are going to see the advantages of CLL. Well, first of all, it enhances learner autonomy. You may be surprised because it's seen as, well, there's totally dependence upon the translation and teacher, but we need to remember that, well, it's students take full control of their learning and decide which aspects of language to learn. So it's particularly useful for lower levels, and it builds sense of community and mutual trust. And it's also good for adults who have failed at language learning. You may have seen people and adult people who are frustrated at their language learning experiences because after trying for years, they may not still produce the language, but this method allows them to speak instantly. So it can be very motivating for them. So it also encourages self-evaluation, and it helps students be aware of learning process, and the fear and anxiety are overcome by lowering affective filter because they try to establish a sense of community. And it's evidenced by some research that CLL increases motivation and participation of students who are reluctant at early stages. I also included those studies on the references page. Of course, there are some serious disadvantages of CLL. First of all, it's almost exclusive for adult learners. Unfortunately, younger learners, it's not recommended for younger learners, and it's difficult to implement in larger classes as it creates classroom management problems. And it demands enormous energy from the teacher, both psychologically and physically. And of course, teachers need counseling background to carry out those classes, which even complicates the matter more. And teachers and students may be disorientated by the lack of an established syllabus because it relies too much on spontaneity. Some learners may show hostile reactions to the techniques because not everyone can be happy about their voice being recorded and played before people. And there is also relatively less emphasis on error corrections, which may lead to fossilization of errors. So, of course, there are some certain flaws, but does it mean that we should completely abandon community language learning? No, of course not. There are still ways to incorporate CLL into language classes. Well, first of all, communicative intent can be exploited with sporadic activities. You don't have to organize all the teaching around CLLs, but you can still use them as an occasional activity. And the techniques to build sense of community can be used to establish supportive and secure classroom environment. And it's also good for higher level students who have settled in a new country. And one of the classroom experiences that I've seen on YouTube features a group of adult higher level students, like, well, let's say relatively higher level students, get together in the classroom and try to share their experiences on, on living in a new country, and the teacher tries to guide their experiences and have them share their opinions, then reformulate their sentences to organize the teaching. This method is also known as participatory approach, and it's closely related with community language learning. And total dependence on translations can evolve into reformulations as the levels are higher up. And the positive impact on motivation and participation can be exploited for speaking activities as variation. So, community language learning has brought different dimensions to language learning, such as whole person and counseling approaches, as we previously mentioned. Yes, CLL may not be the sole method for language learning, but it can still be used as an occasional activity, and the stages can be modified for higher levels, as we have seen in the previous slides. And there are, of course, useful methods for adult beginners who have anxiety over language learning, and still teachers can benefit from the non-judgmental characteristics of community language learning. And even more importantly, the humanistic side of CLL must not be disregarded. This concludes my speech. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.